This conference will now be recorded.
Great, thanks. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, and with the changes to our snowpack and our glaciers, and with the warming temperatures that we've been experiencing, we've seen changes in our stream flow. So our peak stream flow in the Northwest is getting earlier. It's up to 20 days earlier now since mid-century. But it does depend on your location, but on average it's moved about 20 days earlier. We've seen a huge increase in the number of large fires in the area burned in the Northwest since 1973. The fire season length has increased over each of the last 4 decades as well, from 23 days in the 70s to 43 days long in the 80s to 84 days long in the 90s, and then 116 days in the 2000s. And we're seeing changes in sea level. So sea level is rising. Globally, sea level has risen about 6 to 8 inches over the last century. Here in the Northwest, the relative sea level rise that we're actually experiencing really varies because we live in such a tectonically active area. We have areas of uplift happening along our coast, and we have also areas that are subsiding. And so, for example, in Seattle, we've had sea level rise 8.5 inches over the last century. But out on the coast, we have some areas where relative sea level is actually falling, like at Neah Bay, it's rising faster than absolute sea level. And so we've actually seen relative sea level decline. But globally, sea level has been rising, and we've been experiencing that more in some places than others in the Northwest. And we're also seeing changes in the distribution of plants and animals in response to all of these changes. We don't have very much specific information on changes in range shifts specifically to our local area, though there is some, but on average, globally, species ranges have been shifting 17 kilometers poleward per decade on average, and 11 meters upward in elevation per decade. That's a good thing in that movement is a primary way that species respond to climate change. So they're moving to track suitable areas of climate across the landscape. They want to move to where it's comfortable for them. And the problem is when they can't keep pace with the speed of climate change, which is fairly unprecedented right now, or when there's nowhere for them to go because they're already at the limits of their range. So for example, pika that becomes stranded on mountaintops. And then other problems are that species are moving individualistically. Even though on average they're moving northward and upward, different species are moving at different paces and in different directions. And so we can have species associations that are really important, like between pollinators and hosts, and between predator and prey, that are getting disrupted. And so important species interactions are being changed right now. All of the observed changes that we're seeing in climate and related variables and metric, these are all consistent with what we expect under human-caused climate change. The science of attribution is getting stronger and stronger as the climate signal becomes stronger. So our ability to say that any one event or any pattern that we're seeing is caused by climate change is actually getting a lot easier to do because we're starting to depart so much from historical conditions. So now I'm going to talk about projected future changes in climate in the Northwest. So there are a range of possible futures out there for us, depending on what we choose to do as a society globally. But under all of those scenarios right now, it gets warmer in the Northwest. When you look at mid-century, hopefully you can see my cursor here. When you look at mid-century, our choices don't make that much of a difference. So here's kind of a modest reduction in fossil fuels in blue, and then sort of the business as usual scenario in red here. And it's pretty similar that by the 2050s, we get somewhere between 3 and 9 degrees warmer, depending on the outliers here in our models. But on average, the average isn't that different between a moderate and a high emission scenario, somewhere around 3 and 5 degrees It's when you get out to the end of the century that it makes a huge difference what we do. The difference between a moderate emission scenario and a high emission scenario is enormous. But under all scenarios, it will get warmer, but it could get a lot warmer if we don't reduce greenhouse gases very quickly. So it's a little different when we look at precipitation. We have historically, so here's our historical annual precipitation, average annual precipitation in the Northwest. We have a lot of variability in our precipitation in the Northwest. We have very wet years and very dry years. So there's a lot of noise in the signal. And so when we look out to the future, that's in part why we don't see a huge change in our average annual precipitation under either scenario, the moderate or the high emission scenario. It gets just a little bit wetter on average in the Northwest. The real difference that we see is how that precipitation is distributed across the year when we see our precipitation and how much and what kind. So we see our seasonal patterns reinforced. We're expecting wetter fall, winter, spring, and drier summer more likely. We expect more rain than snow than we have historically, and we expect to have more frequent heavy rainfall events. So this is one of those cases where it's really important to realize that the average hasn't changed, but we don't live in an average world a lot. There's many things that are really important to how we experience precipitation beyond the average over the course of the year. So looking across projected changes, again, we expect continued warming, and that becomes sensitive to the carbon emission scenario we take, especially towards the end of the century. But under all emission scenario, we have to plan for warming. We expect to see increasing heavy rainfall events. So those heaviest rain events, those atmospheric rivers, could become almost 20% more intense by the end of the century. We expect to see more sea level rise. In Seattle, that could be anywhere from 4 to 56 inches. There's a wide range in how much we could see, how much sea level rise we could see, and that's because it's so sensitive to what happens to ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, where there is some uncertainty over how they're going to respond to the warming that we experience, and also how much more greenhouse gases we put into our atmosphere. And across all of these changes, we have it going on, this ongoing natural variability, where there could be much hotter years and then years that are not so hot. There could be much wetter and drier years, years with more snowpack, years with less snowpack. So even as we have this ongoing variability, the trends are going to be changing and turning upwards for more warming, more heavy rainfall, higher sea level. So a couple things to take a deeper dive into that are particularly relevant to riparian areas. One would be snowpack. So we're going to take a deeper dive into hydrology for a moment here. So this is our historical April 1st snowpack. So we measure it in snow water equivalent. It's the amount of water held in an amount of snow. And this is our historical snowpack, where areas of deeper blue are areas with more snow, and lighter blue is less snow, and then the areas in white don't have any snow typically by spring. When we move out into the 2020s, this is under a moderate emission scenario. We see on average almost a 30% loss of our snowpack. And so one thing to be clear is that when we talk about climate, we're talking about a 30-year window that's centered on a time. So when I say 2020s, I mean a 30-year window around 2020, which is, we're here. So we expect a almost 30% loss compared to historical, and that's about on track with the fact that we've already seen about a 25% decrease. So we're going to see a little more in the coming years. When we get out to the 2040s, we're getting up to a 44% loss of our snowpack, and then things really accelerate by the end of the century. Without a dramatic change to our greenhouse gas emissions, we could see a 65% loss of our snowpack in Washington. The things to notice here, in addition to how large this loss is without action, is a lot of this is happening at lower elevations. So in our highest elevations, like in the North Cascades, we still have quite a lot of snow, but our low elevation snow, our mid elevation snow, is what's really going to take a hit. And at the southern lower latitudes as well. So more south in the Cascades, we're losing more snow than more north in the Cascades. If there's any good news here, it's that where you can't see, so we go higher up into the Columbia Basin, into some of the headwaters of the Columbia, it's far enough north and it's high enough that they actually continue to get a good amount of snow well into the end of the century, and in fact might even get a little more snow because we have more winter precipitation and it's still cold enough there where it's being held as snow. So that's good news for the Columbia in the long run. But a lot of the streams that are fed by these middle elevation snowpacks in spring are going to have a hard time. What does this look like? What does the impact of the change in our winter precipitation mean for our basins and their hydrology? One way to look at this is looking at whether our basins are snow dominated or rain dominated typically. So all of the basins here in green are typically dominated by rain throughout the course of the year. Most of their winter snow, most of their winter precipitation, as well as their spring and summer and fall, is falling as snow. The areas in red here, these are the areas that are what we would call transition basins, where our winter precipitation starts out in the fall as rain, and then it turns into snow as it gets colder, and then turns back into rain in the spring. So those are transition basins. The blue basins here are what we call snow dominant. It starts snowing very early there as soon as our winter precipitation arrives in the fall, and it stays as snow throughout the rest of the rainy season. And so what happens as it gets warmer is that we see changes where more of these red transition basins turn into rain-dominated basins as it gets warmer, and more of these blue snow-dominated basins become transition basins. So here's our historical distribution with our snow-dominated in blue and the transition in red, and then green is rain. And as you look from the 2020s and 2040s and 2080s, we see the blue starting to disappear and more reds becoming green. And a lot of this is because here in Washington, we have very warm snow, and anyone who skis is very familiar with this. And I know you're all work in riparian areas, so you're very familiar with this too, but our snow line is so sensitive to warming, where if anyone who skis, you go up to Snoqualmie Pass, it's like flipping a coin. Is it going to be rain? Is it going to be snow? So it doesn't take very much warming in Washington to turn our snow into rain. And that's why we have these red areas here. Our transition watersheds are extremely sensitive to climate change. It just doesn't take much warming to turn them into rain-dominated systems. And so what does this mean for our hydrology? We are going to see our stream flow change. So here's a rain-dominant, one of those green basins, the Chehalis River at Porter. This is the hydrograph. Many of you are probably familiar with these, but if you're not, it's showing the stream flow over the course of the year. So starting in the fall, the rains begin. We see the stream level rise as more and more rain falls over the winter, and then it tapers off over the spring and summer. And here in black is the historical stream flow pattern. Blue is the 2020s, yellow is the 2040s, and red is the 2080s under a moderate emission scenario. So the hydrology of those green basins, the rain-dominant basins, doesn't change very much under climate change because it was already all rain. The big changes come in these watersheds that are transition watersheds, where historically in black here for the Yakima River at Parker, the rain starts in the fall, and then it gets cold enough that the rain turns to snow. The stream flow goes down as it all gets stored in snow until it starts warming up and the snowpack starts melting. And then we get that typical big bump. Our peak stream flow happens in late spring and then drops till we get our lowest flows in the end of the summer. Under climate changes, those transitional watersheds get warmer. We see that drop as it turns to snow starts disappearing because it doesn't turn to snow anymore. It gets warm enough that it just keeps raining. And so we get just a little dip and then a lower peak because there's less snowpack to melt in the spring. And as we move on into the later parts of the century, it becomes a rain dominant watershed where it never gets trapped as snow. It just looks a lot like our typical rain dominant watershed. All the water goes in as it arrives, and then it drains out in the summer. Our snow dominant watershed, so this is the Columbia River at the Dalles. Again, it's not that much of a change, the ones that remain snow dominant, but we do have not as much of a drop, but we start getting a little bit of a bump in stream flow over the winter from all of those lower elevation feeder watersheds that are bringing in more rain now and more stream flow over the course of the winter, where it's not being trapped as snow anymore. And for all of these, you can see that the late summer flows get much lower because there's less snowpack feeding it and because it's hotter. So our stream temperatures are changing too. Some caveats, these are all naturalized flows. So I'm showing you flows without the influence of dams. And these don't include atmospheric river events. So when we see those more intense rain events happening as move on in the century, when we have more intense atmospheric rivers, that means we might be looking at changes to these hydrographs even beyond what we're seeing here. And also, all of this could lead to flashier streams. So that's another thing to consider with riparian areas. So looking at stream temperatures, again, because we have higher ambient air temperature, because we have less snow fed we have less snow feeding into our snow melt feeding into our streams, and lower water levels, lower stream flows. All of those is going to bring us warmer streams. And so here's the historic. This is all from Norwest for those of you who are familiar with those stream temperature models. Here's our historic stream temperatures in August in the Northwest, zoomed into Washington here. And so we have our typically very warm streams here in red, our cold streams here in blue, and then green are moderate warming to orange. And as we move on later in the century, we see more and more of these very warm streams starting to appear at higher and higher elevations. So we have, oh, that's funny. So we're looking at a lot of warming of our streams over the course of the century. And this is under a moderate emission scenario. So now I'm going to look quickly at wildfire risk. We are expecting to see an increase in area burned, and this is including in areas where fire has historically been rare. There's a lot of work going on now to understand the risk to the west side. The west side is much harder to anticipate how the fire regime might change because we don't have as much of a historical record as on the east side where fire is common, but we know that large fires have happened on the west side of the Cascades. They happened infrequently, but they happened very quickly and they were very large. And we do expect that we could have higher fire risk as climate change proceeds, but it's difficult to get numbers on by how much we might be seeing that. As far as just the increase in probability of large fires in general across the Northwest, we're looking at estimates from moving from a 1 in 20 probability of a large fire year historically to a 1 in 2 large fire year by the end of the century, and that's under a medium emission scenario. So with all these changes, we do expect to see changes in vegetation, but it's difficult to say with any real precision or accuracy what that future vegetation is going to look like. We can get some general impressions of the kinds of change, like the magnitude of the change we might see in the range of possible futures using models like this is from MC2, which is a process-based model of vegetation. And so this is a historical vegetation model where we have forest here on the west side, we have conifer forest, and we have cool mixed forest. And then on the east side, moving into Columbia Plateau, the model is giving us grassland and shrubland, woodland. As we move into the future, the model has still forest on the west side, but now it's a warm mixed forest, which with much less of that conifer forest. Now that's up into the higher elevations in the Olympics and the Cascades. And on the east side, it's giving us a lot of woodland savanna, no more of that, what it's calling the grassland biome. And the main thing to keep in mind here is when you look across, so this is, I'm just showing you like, this is the composite of like 20 different global climate models all mushed into what is the most frequently seen vegetation type across all of those models, across an average of the climate we might see in the future. And the things to keep in mind are that when you look at a model like MC2 for comparing historical to future, the kinds of things that I take out of these models are that pretty much under any scenario you're looking at, you're going to still have forest on the west side. The thing that I've noticed looking across different MC2 models on the east side is there is much more uncertainty around what's going to happen on the east side for vegetation. It really varies between being woodland, grassland, shrubland, and the answer is not to get, I mean, ideally it'd be great if we could have the models tell us exactly what's going to happen. But in some cases, it's just, there's just inherent uncertainty in how a system is going to respond. And so the answer there is not to throw out the models and say, this isn't going to help me, but to say, okay, we're probably going to have forest on the west side. We probably need to be scenario planning on the east side, recognizing that there are a range of possible futures that could play out on the east side. And we need to be prepared for that. And we're not going to wait for a magic model to tell us exactly what's going to happen, because the future over there is inherently much more uncertain than the one on the west side because of the complexity of that system and its sensitivity. Some general take homes from what the climate models can tell us is that we are seeing and we expect to see hotter, drier summers and warmer winter winters. We're expecting lower summer flows and higher winter flows. We're expecting to see warmer streams, more disturbance events, so more frequent and larger fires, for example, flashier streams, more flooding events. And we're expecting to see changes in vegetation, though there is uncertainty in exactly what that's going to look like, depending, and that uncertainty is higher in some areas than other, particularly on the east side versus the west side. So now I'm going to say a few words about what this all means for riparian areas, and then Greer is really going to get into the nitty-gritty of riparian restoration under climate change. So knowing these impacts can help you prioritize riparian areas to look for areas with less change as good bets for restoration, or areas with high change where restoration could help mitigate those changes and make those areas more resilient. But the most important thing is just to be aware of these projected changes so that your planning accounts for them. Riparian areas are also expected to be relatively sensitive to climate change due to those changes in stream flow and disturbance and species distributions, and not to mention impacts of invasive species. So it's hard to predict how invasives are going to respond to climate change, because there will be winners and losers among invasives too. They are also going to be affected by climate change. But given the increased level of disturbance we expect to see in general, and especially in riparian areas, there's reason to believe invasives are going to be a challenge. And yet, at the same time, riparian areas have frequently been suggested as really important areas for climate adaptation. And that's because they're expected to facilitate species range shifts and to also provide climatic refugia from warming. So they're expected to facilitate range shifts because they span climatic gradients. So species are going to be trying to move along climatic gradients from warmer to cooler areas, and riparian areas are these sort of natural climate corridors. And species already use riparian areas as movement corridors. So there's good reason to believe they're going to keep using riparian areas to disperse as they respond to climate change. Riparian areas are also expected to provide climatic refugia from warming because they contain these microclimates that are significantly more moist and cool than immediately surrounding areas. And finally, they should offer particularly effective conservation umbrellas under climate change because they have really high species richness relative to upland areas. They provide habitat for riparian as well as for many upland species who might use riparian habitats at certain times or certain part of their life cycles. Riparian health is a direct contributor to that of adjacent freshwater habitats. And finally, riparian areas are often just the last remaining natural vegetation left in heavily modified landscapes because of zoning and other reasons. And so they offer really rare and important opportunities for species that need to move across and use these really highly modified landscapes as the climate warms. So even though riparian areas have been widely recognized for their value under climate change, there haven't been that many attempts to figure out which riparian areas might be most important under climate change. I did an analysis with some colleagues looking at riparian areas expected to be particularly important under climate change, so how to prioritize riparian areas under climate change that are expected to promote species range shifts and provide refugia. You can actually, I provide a link for the paper later, and the data sets are all available online. But we created this riparian climate corridor index where the highest values are the areas here in blue and the lowest are in beige. They're riparian areas with high canopy cover, because we know that species are more likely to move through riparian areas with high canopy cover, and they're cooler. They're relatively wide, lots of evidence that species are more likely to move through wider riparian corridors. They're relatively shaded by local topography to keep them cooler. They're areas with relatively low human modification, and they're ones that span significant climate gradients, so that will move a species from a warmer to a cooler habitat. So not surprisingly, the highest values are in the mountains because they're in relatively good condition, they have steep gradients, shaded, and the lowest values are in relatively flat, highly modified areas like the Columbia Plateau. But because these riparian climate corridors are probably most important in areas like the Columbia Plateau that are relatively hammered and flat and hot, we also looked at the highest value riparian climate corridors within ecoregions. So we can see those that might be highest priority for climate adaptation in the Columbia Plateau as well as across the Northwest. And here's just what it looks like if you zoom in on one of these watersheds, and all of this stuff is available online. So in summary, riparian systems are expected to be relatively sensitive to climate change for all the reasons I listed. But if you consider climate impacts when you're doing riparian restoration, it can help ensure the long-term effectiveness of your efforts. And we also expect riparian areas to be especially valuable for climate adaptation because they are these natural corridors, because they're relatively cool and in relatively good condition in highly modified areas. And there are resources out there to help you identify those priority riparian sites for restoration under climate change. And Greer is going to talk more about tools for doing riparian restoration under climate change in a moment. So thanks very much. And I assume you'll get links to the slides or the recording, but I provided some links for some of the stuff that I went over, including some nice places to get hold of user-friendly climate data with viewers, as well as the links to the climate corridor index I talked about, and then some references for the changes we expect to see in Washington. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much, Meade. We're gonna switch over to Greer, and then we will have some time for Q&A at the end here. I see a few of you have already started putting questions in the chat box. For those of you who are just joining us, feel free to use that chat box and put your questions in early, and then we'll go down the list when we get to it. So Greer Maier is the Science Program Manager with the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board. Greer has worked as a fish biologist for the past 10 years. She received a Master's of Science from the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fisheries Science, studying juvenile Chinook salmon in the Columbia River estuary. Her professional experience includes working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Geological Survey, NOAA, National Marine Fishery Service, and the U.S. Forest Service. She was also awarded a NAUS Fellowship in 2007 to work in Washington, D.C. on national fisheries issues. Greer not only loves working in the rivers of north central Washington, she also enjoys recreating on and around them with her family. So thanks so much for joining us, Greer, and take it away.
Thanks, Trisha. Can you see my screen okay?
Sure can.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. It's so good to see such a big group on the phone. And thank you, Trisha and Meade, for collaborating on this. I think it's a really good topic of conversation, and I'm excited to share some of my thoughts on this. I'm generally more involved in a broader range of restoration tools, but this was actually a really good thought exercise to think how some of what we're doing more broadly, it pertains particularly to riparian restoration. So Meade, I think, covered a lot about the scope of the change in the area that we live, and we know things are going to change. And what I'm going to cover today is just really some ideas about how that changes or challenges the way that we do restoration, and particularly riparian restoration, because it's really important to think differently about what we're doing in the context of what we think might happen. And there's a lot of literature out there and great ideas, and this is just a snapshot of some of the things I found while researching for this presentation. And I found a lot of great ideas and ways of thinking about how we might do restoration differently considering climate change, and particularly related to restoration planning. And really, I think what I want to talk about particularly is what is called climate smart restoration. And it's really about thinking about restoration in a way that enhances the entire resiliency of the ecosystem. So it's not just about focusing on one aspect of the ecology or the habitat, but really thinking about how we can enhance the full function and resiliency of the areas in which we work so that they can be more adaptable in the future. Because there's going to be a lot of changes, and the more resilient and functional these habitats are, the more they'll be able to persist into the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a few different scales at which you could apply this climate smart planning. The regional scale Meade covered, I really think looking into some of those results in terms of snowpack and flow and temperature is really a great starting point. There's a ton of information at the state level and even getting down into the regional scale about what the changes might look like in each of our individual areas. And I think that helps provide context about what's important to consider, whether it's dramatic changes in snowpack or snow level, whether it's big changes to air temperature or stream temperature, and where those are likely to occur within the region, changes in flow, whether it's high flows or low flows. All of those are really important in terms of knowing what the challenges are going to be moving forward, because each of those impacts our ability to do restoration, in particular our ability to be successful with restoration in riparian areas. Excuse me. So stepping down, I generally work at both the regional and watershed scale. I think the watershed scale, and when I say watershed, I mean like the sub-basin scale. I think that's really where you can start to bring in a lot of data and information and develop decision support tools or prioritization tools. And I've spent the last, about 3 or 4 years developing different tools. Couple years last year, I guess, we developed a fish passage barrier prioritization tool using the same framework I'm going to present. And we're currently in a process of doing the same thing for all restoration and protection projects. And it can be applied to a particular type of restoration tool, or it can be broadly for all restoration tools. And it just kind of depends on what you're trying to prioritize. The same framework can apply to any restoration strategy. So how do you build these GIS tools? The first thing is that you decide what metrics you want to pull in. And it depends on what you're looking at. So I'm going to focus on what you might consider for riparian restoration. So you want to select metrics that you'd like to look at and the type of data that you might want to bring into your prioritization scheme. Climate metrics are great to bring in at this level. Think about which metrics, like I said, using that information about what might change, bring that into your decision about what kind of information you might want to use to prioritize your restoration actions. And you create weights. So what's more important? You have to have discussions about, which of the climate metrics are most important, which are going to change the most, or what are going to be the most important to species of interest. So you kind of think about how different aspects of your prioritization tool are important and assign weights. Then you compile the data. The more you can use GIS or geospatial data, the easier this is. Basically, you're creating a suite of different GIS layers and then applying a scoring and ranking process to it, and then generating basically a map of where you might want to focus on the landscape. And the data that you compile can either be through data acquisition using readily available GIS layers. There's a lot of resources out there that are free and easy to use. It may be going out and doing an assessment in the field, compiling or collecting data that you can plug into your tool. The last thing is that you combine those data and metrics into a scoring process. You can build a GIS model builder or have someone do it for you, but basically it's just applying a scoring scheme and weighting scheme to a suite of data, and then you combine it at any various levels. So at this point, we've done it at Huck 12 scale, and then we're now doing it at the reach scale. You could do it based on different sites of interest, different sites that you're considering for planting. Any different scale works with this type of tool. So some of the data that you might pull in when you're considering, and you don't have to use a GIS tool like that or a really structured GIS platform. You could just pull in the layers and evaluate each and use that in your decision making. It just depends on how in-depth or how sort of process driven you want to get. But here are some of the data you might pull in and at least look at and consider how it might change where you're going to work on the landscape. So the Norwest, Meade already mentioned the Norwest database. It is better in some areas than others. So the more you can find local stream temperatures and modeled stream temperatures, Norwest goes for a 2040 and 2080 modeled stream flow. And at least for us, it seems to work pretty well. At least if you roll it up to a Huck 12 scale or a larger catchment scale, it would give you a sense of which watersheds are going to be most susceptible to temperature change. The other one is the Streamflow metrics that are available from the Forest Service. These are called the VIC. These give you modeled changes in terms of base flows and high flows. So this is another one you can look at, the changes in flows. And there's lots of other information on flow. This is just the one that I use. And there's drought information too. The Forest Service has brought together a lot of different GIS layers pertaining to drought. And so you could, I put the links into this presentation, so those will be sent out if you're interested. But drought might be another modeled input that you might want to consider. And then we just recently, for this workshop, we've developed a climate risk sort of ranking. Basically using the Norwest and VIC, we combine those two and just tried to highlight streams that were going to have the most change in the future. There's some methodology which is documented if you're interested, but this is available on our website if you want to look at both changes to temperature, to high flows, and to base flows, and kind of look at where you're going to have the most change. You can download this GIS layer and use it off of our data portal. And the Forest Service has a great suite of GIS layers available on climate and information. So I encourage you to check out their website. They've been really helpful in terms of providing information that we've used in GIS. The next thing you might want to do is an assessment or riparian assessment in the field, and that might be information, it's likely information you might use in your prioritization, looking for areas that are most impaired or have the most opportunity to provide shade. So the Grand Ronde has a good example of doing a really well done riparian prioritization project using LiDAR, NAPE, and field-based data. So if you have that information already, you would just plug it into your tool, or you may use satellite or other LiDAR data to gather that information. And that's what our local Chelan County Natural Resources did. They did a LiDAR-based prioritization tool just based on veg height and potential for shade. The other readily available information, if you don't have LiDAR, you can use in some parts of the Columbia Basin. There's this RCAT and RCA riparian condition assessment tool, which could be applied in your area using DEM and other readily available GIS layers. So I put a link to that as well. Hopefully you can see that. Okay. So once you gather the information, you're going to choose your metrics and your weights. And like I said, you might bring in your climate change metrics. I think one thing to think about too is when we were doing this for our restoration prioritization is whether you want to look for areas that are going to get extremely hot and dry versus areas that aren't going to change as much. So we call this like the Goldilocks scenario, where you probably aren't going to be able to restore areas that are going to change a lot and are going to get really hot. But you might be able to change areas that are just changing a little bit or are not changing so much that it's sort of a lost cause. So think about that in terms of how you create scoring and weighting rules, or how you look at your maps once you've created them. And then your riparian condition gets plugged in to say, which metrics you want to look at, whether it's potential for shade or riparian condition, you would plug those in. If you have species or habitat attributes that you'd like to consider, areas on the landscape that are more important for various species. For us, it's a lot about spawning areas or major or minor spawning areas, or different life stage use within the watershed. You could plug those in and include those in the suite of different GIS layers that you're considering. And then habitat attributes. So what other habitat attributes are you considering? Maybe it's large wood, you're looking at recruiting more large wood. You may plug in where you're lacking large wood to help determine where you would do riparian restoration. So again, I would point to the Grand Ron has done a really good job of looking at restoration priorities using a suite of different GIS layers, some of which they generated themselves and some of which they gathered from GIS layers. They use the distance from spawning as part of their prioritization to focus in areas that are close to spawning areas, and they use the shade deficit to focus on areas that had the most potential to increase shading and reduce temperatures. And then ours, we also are in process, but if you have questions or want to look at another example, we are developing a riparian prioritization based on a whole suite of different limiting factors, habitat attributes, and project potential. And then I want to just talk briefly about the importance of modeling. So modeling can be a really important tool. Once you've developed sort of a plan for where you want to do work, you can plug it into these models, and they can be used to evaluate, where your best suite of actions might be on the landscape. So in the Snoqualmie, they've done this using a DHSVM hydraulic model and looking at scenarios for full riparian restoration to see how much they could reduce temperatures. So this might be an important tool to bring in if you have the resources to try to say, can we even reduce temperatures even if we do a full restoration scenario? And maybe looking for thresholds at which if we don't do this much, we won't affect temperature. Excuse me. So this could be an important tool that you could use too as some sort of modeling environment. You can also look at different parts of the landscape and where you might have the best bang for your buck. So in the Grand Ron, they looked at overall whether they could reduce temperature, stream temperature. So they were looking at time periods in the 2080s, and we're going to see an increase of 2.7 degrees. But if they did a full restoration within those high priority areas, they were able to decrease temperatures by 1.9. So they were able to mitigate the increases due to climate change. And this just gives an example of the current conditions in terms of temperature within a particular watershed or within a particular main stem and different reaches, and under different scenarios within the model where they looked at veg riparian restoration and also changes to stream width. But when you looked at the results a little more closely, it was interesting to see that there was some point within the watershed where you had less of an impact on stream temperatures. So higher up, riparian restoration had a big impact on reducing stream temperatures, but as you got closer to Catherine Creek, basically the main stem reaches, you had a lot less impact on overall stream temperature. So there was more benefit of doing riparian restoration higher in the watershed. So now I'm going to talk just briefly about different ideas about how climate change might impact your implementation of projects and plans once you have something. And really, a project should be designed to succeed under multiple scenarios. So we need to start thinking about whether the projects that we're designing or considering, if we have a landowner come forward who's willing to do riparian restoration, thinking about how that site might change in the future and thinking about different scenarios. So just generally in restoration, what we've started to do is just think about the worst case scenario. So if flows were to decrease to what they were maybe in 2015 or a low flow year for you, think about what conditions at that site might look like during a year like that and how that might change your plans. And Tim Beachy did a great job in a paper in 2013 where he really looked at how to evaluate individual projects and plans. And there's this decision tree in there that you can look at to kind of decide how you might change your strategy at either the site level or at a planning level that's much larger. And what he found, he evaluated different basically restoration tools. And interestingly enough, although we think that riparian restoration is something that is good at mitigating climate change, it actually is one of the lower ranked tools that he found in terms of its long-term ability to ameliorate climate change impacts. But the interesting thing is that a lot of the tools that he did find that ameliorated climate change also benefit riparian areas. So one way to think about this is Joe Wheaton's sort of theory that I'm applying to how we could think about riparian restoration in terms of, this slide that I just showed. That there's lots of different tools in our toolbox for riparian, and we might start to think about how we can enhance riparian areas in ways that enhance the entire system. So our typical riparian restoration projects are really more like surgery. Not all of them, but a lot of them. We go out, we plant trees, we have a plan, we have lots of plants, lots of work, lots of maintenance, watering, but we can think about other ways to get riparian restoration on the landscape through a riparian health sort of view versus surgery is sort of one tool in the toolbox, but we can also stay healthy by just drinking water and exercise, healthy diet. And that's really about restoring the processes that create and maintain riparian forest. And in this case, you may have little to no planting. You can treat a much larger footprint in some cases. There's little to no maintenance, and you may have higher survival and definitely higher resiliency within your riparian area. And there's definitely areas where we might need surgery. Definitely areas or opportunities where planting and doing traditional riparian restoration might be appropriate. But there's other areas where we can start to think differently about how we might restore the riparian forest at a large landscape scale. And so I just bringing up this idea that maybe our riparian restoration toolbox could be expanded a little bit. And I'm going to touch on some restoration tools and techniques that we've really gotten excited about and might be applied to riparian restoration. So we have the traditional plantings, like I said, and really when we're considering those in our toolbox, we need to think about future climate conditions and choosing the plants that should be planted, what's going to survive and be most resilient to future changes, given that we're going to have probably changes in flow and temperature, and need to consider the scale. At what scale is it really going to make a difference? And also think about future maintenance. Is it going to survive with the maintenance that it may need if those changes continue to happen? In the future, if the site becomes much drier and much hotter, are we going to need maintenance going forward for a long time? So we just need to think about whether our projects are going to persist into the future if we're doing plantings. Other tools in the toolbox, maybe ones that folks have started to use at least up here and in other areas. So we have beaver relocation, and they've really been shown to increase the extent and resiliency of riparian and wetland areas. We also have beaver dam analogs, which have been used in areas across the Northwest, and they have been an effective tool as well in increasing floodplain inundation, storing water, and increasing riparian health. And then the newest one is stage 0 restoration, which I'll touch a little more in a second, which is similar to the BDA, it's just a different technique. And all of the ones, the beaver and BDA and stage 0 are really about process-based restoration. And where we can do it, I think it's the key to our, having a really big impact on restoration of our riparian areas at a large scale. So the principles, this is Steve Bennett's slide. They address the root cause of the problem. They're at the scale of the problem, and they're consistent with the site and have clearly articulated ecological outcomes. So thinking differently about what we're trying to do at the site scale. And for stage 0 restoration, there's a lot of resources if you don't already know about it. But really, it's called stage 0 restoration, and this is just of the process-based restoration. I just want to give an example to talk about or to highlight what I'm talking about. So stage 0 is really just part of the stream evolution model. A lot of our streams are down here in this degraded and widening or arrested degradation stage. And where we get the most functional riparian and resilient aquatic systems is up here on this side of this circle. So the goal is to get streams that are degraded on this side over to this side into either the stage 8 or stage 0 steps so that they can be sustainable in the future. And our current issues with water availability and survival of plantings, is a lot to do with the fact that we're trying to work within these streams that are highly degraded, and the water table is generally much lower than what would be needed to maintain those plantings. So in the future, with even lower water tables in some of these streams, it's going to be an even bigger challenge and may lead to even more failures. So we need to think about where there's opportunities, and not everywhere will have these, but where there's opportunities to take a water table that's down and we're trying to plant up on these sort of high and dry areas. Really, is there an opportunity to raise the bed elevation and spread out the water across the floodplain so that trees and riparian species can naturally recruit and can be self-sustaining over the long term? And here's just, probably don't have a lot of time, but I'll just give a visual because it's a lot more powerful. Here's some just before and afters from Waichus Creek down on the Deschutes. Here was before and then after, and you can just see they've had extensive restoration of the riparian areas where they've done a lot of these projects. They don't even have to plant, they have, sorry. They have natural recruitment and almost no maintenance. So, let me get back to that. So the other good thing about these process-based restoration tools, which you can learn a lot about, is that they open up a lot of new opportunities on the landscape. A lot of them are in smaller streams. There's a large area within the watersheds in which we can apply these techniques, and we can have a large impact on the watershed overall. And here's some resources if you're more interested in the process-based restoration. The Utah State Restoration Consortium. Here's 2 links to some of their trainings and resources. We put on a stage 0 workshop, and I have those materials here too that you can find. And just to wrap everything up, I think I just want to drive home the point that riparian restoration is key to our future climate resilience, as Meade touched on. I think restoration and large-scale restoration of riparian areas is going to be really important to our future climate resiliency, given the changes we're likely to see and are already seeing. Our planning needs to reflect what we think might happen in the future and what we have really good information to help us use in our planning. And I think expanding our toolbox, so we're not just using the traditional tools that we have, but expanding it so we can work on a larger landscape and maybe have some different techniques that might be more successful in the future. And I think any opportunities to implement process-based restoration are going to be more successful in the future, and we might have a larger impact when we start applying those. And they're more likely to have an impact on stream temperature. That's all I have, Trisha. Do you want to take back control?
Great, yeah, thank you. So we've got some time for questions. It looks like our first question is for Meade. And actually, Meade, I'm going to give you control again because this question is related to a specific slide. So you may want to pull that up real quick. So this first question is from Christine. In the slide showing river temperature by 2080, there was a lot more white on the map, especially in areas that were more red historically. Is this indicating that streams will dry up in those areas? Meade, you might be on mute still.
I am. Thanks. That is a really good question, actually. Let me, oops. Why is that? You know what? I actually don't know the answer to that. I haven't. Greer, do you know why there's more white in some of those areas? I'm seeing where you're looking, like in the Columbia Basin and the Columbia Plateau. And I'm not sure why that would be. I didn't think that the model.
I think they probably dry up is the only thing I can think of. Maybe those streams dry up and are no longer there.
But that's what I find strange is that that's not what this model looks at. You know what I mean? Like I wouldn't have thought because it's not that kind of a hydrologic model.
Oh, that's true.
I didn't think it was, and so that surprises me. I don't know. I'm sorry. The person who would know would be if you went to the Norwest website. You could get in touch with Dan Isaac, who developed the model, and he would most certainly know. But yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That's something I should know.
Thanks, Meade. Our next question is from Carrie, and this was in relation to that species list map that you had up with different vegetation types, or the different vegetation types map. And so I think Carrie's wondering if we could have a species list for the different vegetation types. Carrie, can you use the chat function just to confirm you're looking for examples about what goes into each of those vegetation types? Is that correct? Yes. Meade, do you have a species list like that would be shareable?
You know, it's actually, I haven't looked at it recently, but my recollection is it's more complicated than that. I don't think it actually is like a species list. It's more of a functional type. So I don't think it's, I'm trying to think if we've actually tried to crosswalk it with other vegetation classifications. My recollection is that you would have to do some kind of crosswalk because it's not based on a list. It's more based on vegetation, sort of like a type of vegetation, not by species, but more like woody or grassy, or it's not. They don't. My recollection is they do not provide a list. And again, you would want to go to the MC2 literature, and that would be the place to find it.
Okay, thanks.
And that would be Dominique Bachelet is the woman who developed that that model.
Great, thank you, Meade. Our next question is from Heather. I would expect these anticipated climate changes should guide how riparian forests and other forests are managed, as well as restored to address increased fire seasons and intensity. Are you aware of any private, tribal, federal, or state land managers currently incorporating climate change in their management plans?
I don't know, was this for Greer, for me, or for both?
I think it could be for both. You want to take a stab? It doesn't say.
I'm gonna let Greer answer first.
Sorry, will you repeat the question? I didn't see it in the box, and I thought it was for me.
So I would expect these anticipated climate changes should guide how riparian forests and other forests are managed, as well as restored to address increased fire seasons and intensity. Are you aware of any private, tribal, federal, or state land managers currently incorporating climate change in their management plan?
That's a good question. I would assume the DNR and Forest Service are, although that's a really good question. I agree. I think that fire risk is one I didn't touch on, and I should have in retrospect. Knowing where you're going to have future changes in fire might be something really important to consider in that stack of information. If, especially the areas that are really susceptible to burning in the future, that, the areas that are really high risk, treating those areas differently because they're almost certainly going to burn in the future is really important to consider how you treat those areas, or even still maybe how you go back in there after they've been burned. So I'm not sure, but I imagine that DNR and Forest Service are considering that, maybe not in the context of riparian restoration, but definitely in terms of forest management. Riparian is an interesting one. I work with the Forest Service a lot, and riparian seems to just fall through the cracks because it's kind of out of the realm of the terrestrial folks that I work with, who are more interested in cutting trees and getting timber. And it's kind of out of the realm of the aquatic folks because it really isn't in our expertise either. It's, we don't generally work on vegetation. So it seems to fall within this crack. And I've been trying to fill it to some extent, but it is a difficult one. And I tend to see, at least in our area, that it really isn't given the attention that it really should be, given how important it is in the landscape for fish and wildlife, and just in terms of forest health and function.
Great, thanks. Our next question is from Fran, who I think is looking for some more discussion on the role of beavers in cooling water, getting additional floodplain connection, and groundwater storage. Fran, feel free to use the chat box if you want to clarify that question at all.
Yeah, the monitoring has been harder to come by with beaver. I mean, I think most people believe and know that they're doing a lot of good on the landscape. But the monitoring that goes with that, at least in our area, has been a lot more difficult. It's a lot more complicated. They tend to spread out the water, so it may get hotter in the beaver pond, but it might be cooler below, and how far down the stream below the beaver dam that flow benefit or temperature benefit before it starts attenuating. So I think it's still important, and I think it's definitely part of our long-term strategy and our climate change adaptation sort of plan. But the information is not as robust as you think it would be. So I don't have a lot to add, except that we have a beaver project here, and I know, so all three of our watersheds have beaver relocation projects that are in place, where they're moving beavers from areas where they're not wanted up into the watersheds where they can move around and be more prolific on the landscape.
I might add a little bit to that. So we, the Northwest Cask recently had a fellow, a graduate student at UW, Ben Brenner, who studied the effect of beaver relocation on streams. And he had really amazing findings. So he worked with the Tulalip tribe in relocating nuisance beavers up into higher areas of watershed that would have historically been beaver habitat, but were currently not occupied by beavers. And what he found was that for every cubic meter of surface water that was impounded by a relocated beaver, another 2.5 cubic meters sank into the earth. And that water, when it reemerged downstream, it led to 2 degrees Celsius cooling, which is, I mean, my jaw dropped when I read the results that they found. So it was making a huge difference in terms of groundwater and stream cooling. And that's just a couple of the things that he found in his study. And I know there's been more work, but the signs are really good that beavers make a really important difference to stream health. And then actually, if I could quickly, I actually looked up just to confirm what I said about MC2. And yes, so what they say is that MC2 does not simulate individual species. It simulates combinations of what they call life forms in functional vegetation types. So like woody life forms and other kinds of life forms. So you would have to do some crosswalking with a lot of assumptions to figure out what species would be in each of those types.
Great, thank you, Meade, for checking in on that. Our next question is from Heather. Some of the modeling seems to indicate that some of our most functional east side watersheds like the Methow are actually most at risk with lowered snowpack. Why is that?
I would be curious what you mean by most functional.
She may mean because the Methow is, compared to the, to some Seattle watersheds, the habitat's fairly intact at the scale of the subbasin. So that might be what she means.
Okay. If those were, so was the question regarding any of the maps that I had been showing around snowpack, or was it things that Greer was showing?
I think this was when Greer was talking.
Okay.
Heather, you can clarify your question in the chat box as well.
Yeah, and it is, the snowpack models are really dependent on obviously temperature and precipitation changes. So I think one thing that's interesting to think about though is how those changes then precipitate through the watershed. It will, how functional and resilient your system is to start with is going to make a huge difference on how those changes are going to propagate. So if you have higher intensity flooding or earlier snow melt or more intense, fires, I think it really makes a difference if you have some extent of resilient and intact habitat and processes in place. So a place like the Methow, at least some parts of the Methow, are going to be able to sort of sustain some of those changes a lot better than other ones where we have, where streams have downcut or been incised and that water is like a fire hose and just degrades the system even further, versus where we have functional floodplains and riparian areas that kind of allow that water to spread out and attenuate downstream.
Thanks. Greer, our next question is for you from Kelsey. What do you think the impact of invasive species in the watershed is on large-scale riparian restoration? If plants are not proactively installed, do you find that restoration can be successful, or is it based on site-specific conditions?
I think it probably is more site-specific. I didn't touch on invasive species mainly because in the interest of time, although I thought about it, it is something important to consider. I think obviously invasive species are going to be a lot more widespread, just, and in the sense that we may just see different species too that can outcompete our native species. Even if they're not invasive, they may just be non-native and they can still outcompete. So just thinking about, what changes you may see in the future and how invasive species might be more of a problem in the future is really something to consider. Yeah, and if you don't install plants, can you be successful? I think it is more site specific, and that was why I was sort of saying it might be easier in some cases if you are able to do more process-based restoration at a site. It really helps with some of these dilemmas, because if you have functional process, you also have more functional species assemblages. So you may not get as many non-native or invasive species if the processes are there to sort of keep those at bay or in check.
Great, thanks. Looks like our next question is from Carrie. Can you speak a little bit about restoring degraded soils, especially in the microbial community and mycorrhizal connections, so we have better success restoring functional riparian communities rather than planted riparian landscapes?
That's a really good point. I personally don't know anything about that, but I think it's a really good point. Obviously, our success is going to depend a lot on the process and the soils and the water. And so considering what you have to work with on a site and how you may be able to sort of apply that sort of process-based theory to the soil or to other aspects of your function on that site might be really a great way to sort of apply that thought process in a different way. But I personally don't know anything about how to restore degraded soils, but I think it's a great idea.
It looks like we have reached the end of our questions. So unless there are, I'll give folks one more second. Oh, here we go. All right. This question is from Jane. In reference to federal state government agencies incorporating climate change into riparian land management, WDFW includes climate change in the riparian ecosystems volume 2 management recommendations for local and state governments in Washington. So that was in reference to an earlier question. And I believe Scott also noted that DNR 20-year forest health modeling builds in some climate aspects. Our next question is, do you have any suggestions or helpful tips when working with hesitant landowners when it comes to BDA installments?
Oh goodness, there's so many people I could get you in touch with that have worked a lot on BDAs. So I guess reach out and I can connect you with them. I'm more of a connector than an expert in any of these, but I think we've done enough BDAs, and even now we've done a fair amount of stage 0 projects. I think as much as you can show them what it'll look like in the future, and I think the landowner willingness to do any of these restoration techniques is a huge consideration. And I obviously didn't have time to talk about that either, but this brings up that point that the tool that you apply has a lot to do with what that landowner is willing to accept and what they would like to do. If they want to do a planting, then that's what you're going to do. And someone just chatted about Julie Vanderwall up in the Okanagan Highlands, and they've been doing BDAs on a large project. And someone asked her, now that you've seen stage 0, would you have done stage 0? And she's like, no, the landowner wanted to do BDAs, and so that's what we're doing. And it may be taking a lot longer, but it also is a huge success story and is helping to spread the message about what BDAs can do in terms of riparian restoration and stream restoration. So, it's a really a low-tech tool, and I think folks have been able to bring in volunteers from the community. I think the more you could get people out helping to build these things, that's the great thing about these tools, is that they are fairly low tech. They're easy to understand. There's not a lot of upfront costs. There's not a lot of design. You don't have to have a lot of design expertise. And there's so many people willing to help, and so many people that are really passionate about these low tech tools. So I think if you're thinking about doing it somewhere, or you want to talk, I think even bringing it up to a landowner as an option might be somewhere just to start.
Great, thanks. All right, last call for questions. I think we've got all of our questions answered. Thank you. I want to say thank you so very much to Greer and Meade. I know how busy you both are, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time today. This was an awesome presentation. So I'm going to try something a little crazy before we log off. I want to unmute everybody, and let's just say a quick thank you to Greer and Meade, and then we'll end for the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
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 Thanks, Trisha.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Trisha.